Well, good afternoon. I don't know about you, but I'm totally exhausted at this point. And I wish that my remarks, given this is the concluding time of our conference, were a little more upbeat. But unlike so many of the scholars that I've listened to and learned from for the last couple of days, I come to Mark Twain from a somewhat different perspective, framed by a half-century of working in the nation's capital region and looking to Twain for insights into the flaws that challenge our imperfect republic. As a journalist, author, lecturer, and public commentator, Mark Twain used his global celebrity platform to apply a common-sense critique of American democracy. Now, we've heard a lot from Shelley and others during this conference about how, in Mark Twain Tonight, Hal Holbrook brought back to the public eye Twain's political and social commentary. Starting in 1959, I attended his one-man show and have attended it about once every decade since, for 5 decades. And my epiphany, and I must confess, probably not as dramatic as John Bird's 3 epiphanies or Huck Finn's tearing up the letter to Mrs. Watson, but my epiphany was Hal Holbrook's performance at the Warner Theater in Washington, D.C., right after the second Iraq invasion. When Holbrook Twain spoke about Congress to this inside the Beltway crowd, they roared with laughter. But when he turned to unjust wars and foreign occupations, the silence in the room was deafening. And I began to explore the contemporary relevance of Twain's political commentary. Now, given recent media, congressional, and public attention focused on threats to democracy today, the nation's cultural and political divide, voter loss of confidence in our governing institutions, the abuse of executive power, the outsized role of money in politics and the legislative process, a politicized media, rising income inequality, and international aggression on many fronts, it might be an opportune time to revisit that Mark Twain of the Gilded Age. Like some of the founding fathers, Twain worried that our republic would not survive an inevitable drift toward autocracy. But he offered some cogent advice about how to slow this process down. Quoting from Mark Twain's novels, essays, letters, interviews, speeches, and his notebooks and autobiography, I suggest 10 topics on which Twain's advice seems most relevant in addressing today's challenges to a healthy democracy. These topics involve systemic flaws that have been percolating for decades and should not be viewed through a partisan lens. Liberal or conservative, Mark Twain was an equal opportunity satirist who used humor and storytelling to speak truth to power. You can decide for yourself what message and, more importantly, what action should be taken on Twain's advice. The Twain 10 lessons are as follows. First, democracy only works if voters are well-informed and actively engaged in the political process. We must upgrade our civic education. If I've learned anything from this conference, it is that teaching Mark Twain literature is a wonderful way to provide history lessons and a sense of what good citizenship really means. Second, patriotism is loyalty to country when it's right, not loyalty to party, persons, or institutions. False patriotism stirs up unjust wars and domestic violence. Third, loyalty to a political party above loyalty to country endangers democratic self-government. As Twain wrote, and I quote, "It is an accepted law of public life that a man may soil his honor in the interest of party expediency, must do so when party expediency requires it, Politicians do wrongful things every day in the party's interest, which they could not be persuaded to do in private life. Fourth, Congress should reflect the will of the people, not moneyed lobbyists, partisan politics, or personal ambition. Voters should elect independent thinking representatives who put the country above party and personal aggrandizement. The influence of money in the legislative process replaces democracy with a plutocracy. Fifth, beware of government overreach, unaccountable bureaucracy, fiscal irresponsibility, and a flawed criminal justice system. Twain criticized the abuse of presidential power when he wrote that Teddy Roosevelt's White House, quote, can concentrate and augment power in the Capitol by despoiling the states of their reserved rights, by packing the Supreme Court with judges friendly to their ambition, and by kicking the Constitution into the backyard whenever it gets in the way, end quote. Twain also worried, though, that government intervention, quote, into the private lives and the private affairs of our citizens and the great danger of our people, that we'll lose their independence of thought and action, which is the cause of much of our greatness, and sink into the helplessness of the Frenchman or the German who expects the government to feed him when he's hungry, clothe him when he's naked, to prescribe when his child may be born and when he may die, and fine, to regulate every act of humanity from cradle to grave. Sixth, achieving a more perfect union means righting the wrongs of racial and gender discrimination. In novels like Huckleberry Finn and Pudd'nhead Wilson, that we've talked a lot about during this conference, and satires, and serious writing about discrimination against the Chinese, or in speeches urging the vote for women, the mature Twain recognized that a healthy democracy requires full participation by all of its populations. Seventh, a free and independent press should hold government accountable. While Twain touted the value of an irreverent press, he worried that corporate and political control of the press encourages sensationalism and the shaping of opinion over the truthfully conveying of facts. Eighth, church and state must be rigorously separated. In Connecticut Yankee, Hank Morgan opines, quote, that an established church is an established crime, a political machine that means death to human liberty and paralysis to human thought. Thus, Twain warned legislatures not to pass laws that, quote, that tell us what we must revere, laws which punish us when we decline to obey them. In light of recent Supreme Court decisions, we might recall Hank Morgan's admonition, and I quote, to confine public religious teaching to the churches and Sunday schools, permitting nothing of it in my other educational buildings. Ninth, innovation, invention, and a skilled and organized workforce are the engines of a dynamic economy. A strong advocate of the free enterprise system, which enables and rewards innovation, Twain nonetheless condemned the worshippers of the almighty dollar and those robber barons who accumulated wealth through monopolistic practices, abuse of competitors, consumers, and workers, and by lobbying for government subsidies. And 10th, finally, U.S. foreign policy should respect the self-determination of all people and seek the peaceful resolution of disputes through diplomacy. Twain's empathy for oppressed populations and his opposition to unjust wars and foreign occupations are well known to all of you. He greatly feared that military intervention fueled by the military-industrial complex, by false patriotism and religious fervor, would inevitably lead to autocracy. Now let me just elaborate with just a few examples of the time I have. The apathy and ignorance of many American citizens today about our heritage and complex democratic system, often fueled by multiple sources of disinformation, is a challenge today. Quote, The trouble with the world is not that many people know so little, it's they know so many things that just aren't so. Twain had an answer. Education, or training, as he put it, expressed in a speech to the YMCA in 1906. Quote, "A little citizenship ought to be taught at the mother's knee and in the nursery. Citizenship is what makes a republic." He elaborated in 1908 when he exhorted the City College of New York alumni. "Is there a college in the whole country where there is a chair of good citizenship? You can begin here. You can place it above mathematics and literature. Good citizenship would teach accuracy of thinking and accuracy of statement. For democracy to work, citizens must think for themselves, not following the herd or seeking only sources of information that reinforce their inherited biases. Each citizen," and I quote, "must speak, and it is a solemn and mighty responsibility and not likely to be flung aside at the bullying of the pulpit, press, government, or the empty catchphrases of politicians." Twain warned that the, quote, "universal conspiracy of the silent assertion lie is hard at work, always and everywhere." Or, in Pudd'nhead Wilson's words, "It is by the goodness of God that in our country we have these three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice neither of them." Informed and engaged citizens are a bulwark against the two greatest threats to democracy: corruption and the trend toward autocracy. Citizens must be actively engaged in the nomination, that is the primary process. They should vote for candidates of character with a record of integrity regardless of political party, and then hold their elected representatives accountable. Informed citizens insist on meaningful elections that address issues of public concern and reject superfluous rhetoric, false narratives, and negative campaigning where opponents are demonized. Engaged citizens do not vote for representatives who buy votes with unconstrained entitlements, such as the Civil War pensions, enact tax incentives that favor the wealthy, or reward political contributors and lobbyists who raise money for their political campaigns. Informed voters would elect representatives who can think and act independently, listen to and respect opposing points of view, and compromise on results in the public interest. Such legislatures would, quote, "not deliver their conscience into another person's keeping by signing pledges and placing loyalty to party or person above personal morality." Twain cautioned, quote, "that to make a pledge of any kind is to declare war against nature, for a pledge is a chain that is always clanking and reminding the wearer of it that he is not a free man." Twain's Congress would ensure that federal programs are necessary, effective, and paid for, and that the executive is efficiently run by qualified and competent civil servants. Now, Twain's first novel, The Gilded Age, written with Charles Dudley Warner, was a roman à clef, a disguised documentary of the scandals of the Grant administration, and especially corruption in Congress. The novel of The Gilded Age enumerates the many threats in Congress to a healthy democracy. First, the outsized role of lobbyists, representing deep-pocket special interests in influencing legislation. Second, how many greases the lobbyists influence by granting access and favoritism. Third, the quid pro quo, legislative rewards for political contributions. Today we call them earmarks. Fourth, congressional self-dealing, how specific legislation enriches its sponsors. 5, parliamentary gamesmanship, distorting parliamentary rules for partisan and re-election advantage. 6, partisan trench warfare, where winning for the party and obstructing the opposing party trumps compromising in the public interest. And 7th, Congress's failure to hold its own accountable, the farce of ethics investigations. The Gilded Age addresses other flaws in our democracy, in the executive branch, the judicial system, local government, the media, and the marketplace, but the centerpiece of the novel is corruption in Congress. In Pudd'nhead Wilson's words, "There is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress." Or in Twain's, Suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress, but I repeat myself. Now today, a member of Congress would have to be an idiot to accept a bribe. Campaign finance laws, as eviscerated by the Supreme Court, are such leaky vessels that an incumbent can easily raise funds to burnish one's lifestyle and assure re-election. Nonetheless, as Twain reminds us, a few still manage to find their way to the penitentiary. My favorite quote in the Gilded Age comes from Senator Dilworthy, who is modeled after the real Senator Pomeroy of Kansas, who was convicted of bribing his way to a third term. Dilworthy explains his first principle, quote, "I never push a private interest that is not justified and ennobled by some larger public good." There's so many contemporary examples of this first principle. For example, a former Speaker of the House of Representatives purchased property and then proposed a nearby highway interchange, which he funded with earmarked dollars. An Appropriations Committee chair earmarked funds to beautify his neighborhood, spending millions of taxpayer dollars to put antique lamps and other advantages to his home in Kentucky. Another member of Congress, for example, I could go on and on, earmarked funds for a university that employed her spouse. Applying what Twain calls the Senate esprit de corps, retiring Senators Shelby, Republican of Alabama, and Leahy, Democrat of Vermont, negotiated the 2022 Omnibus Appropriations Act and included a golden parachute, giving themselves $800 billion in special projects for their states of Alabama and Vermont. A Harvard study showed that members of Congress with access to information and the power to pick winners and losers outperformed the market by 55% on their stock portfolios. That's enough to make a hedge fund manager's head spin. Now, one final example, and I'll wrap this up. In 2010, a secret memo from the House Ethics Committee leaked to the Washington Post describing how a lobbying firm raised $6.2 million in campaign contributions for the re-election of 7 members of Congress, mostly in safe seats. The congressman then steered $200 million in earmarked defense contracts to the clients of the lobbying firm. The lobbying firm then received $114 million in lobbying fees from the contractors. Despite the incriminating emails and the opposition of the Defense Department, the Ethics Committee rushed out a decision finding no ethical violations since all of these actions were legally permitted and disclosed. In the Gilded Age, Twain wrote that a congressional ethics investigation is simply a matter for derision, amusing but not useful. In the Gilded Age and his other novels and writings, Twain had a lot to say about the state of our republic, and it is remarkable how insightful and relevant his commentary remains today. In the words of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Garry Wills in the New York Times, Mark Twain has been gone more than 100 years, but his political wisdom endures. Reflecting his concern about the state of our politics today, in his time, Twain admonished us in terms that are really more prescient today. He said, "It cannot be well or safe to let present political conditions continue indefinitely. They can be improved, and American citizenship should rise up from its disheartenment and see that this is done." Or, as I learned from your session on Mysterious Stranger, maybe it's time to dream a better dream. Thank you very much.